Welcome to our first of this year's collaborations with Riot Games for Latin America. If you want to catch these guides in Spanish, then check out their channel. So, dragons are arguably the most important objective to take in League of Legends. However, their level of importance will vary greatly depending on things like team comps, map state, and which type of dragon is spawning. This is where players mess up and completely throw games time after time by going for dragon at the worst moments possible and never learning from their mistakes, since taking dragon is far more complex than most players seem to realize. Players just see a window where they could take dragon and go for it without understanding the risks versus reward in most cases. Today we're going to simplify things and leave you with all of the information you need to guarantee that you're taking dragons at the right time and avoid needlessly losing games. Let's get into it. In order to make proper decisions around dragon, we should first discuss the value of the individual dragons themselves. Most analysts rate the dragons in this order, the best being Mountain, followed by Infernal, then Cloud and Ocean are about the same in terms of strength. Let's work our way up from the bottom. Why are Ocean and Cloud so poorly rated? Ocean only restores 2.5% of your missing health every 5 seconds. If you were down 200 HP, the buff gives you 5 health every 5 seconds. Not very impressive. Then, the Cloud Dragon only gives 12 ability haste on your ult. That is not very useful in fights, since you only get one use out of your ultimate anyway. It can be useful for champions who have high impact ults like Karthus, Soraka, and Shen, but otherwise it's not seen as that meaningful of a buff. Next up is Infernal, which gives you 4% extra AP or AD. Let's calculate how much that actually is. An Ahri with a standard mid-game build would only get 6 AP from the buff. That's not a massive number to begin with, and Infernal tends to only benefit around 3 champions in a standard team comp. Tanks get nearly 0 benefit from it. This isn't to say the Infernal buff is useless. It does scale a bit decently later into the game, but for a large portion of the game, even champions who benefit from it won't really feel the effects of the buff all that much. Lastly, there's Mountain Dragon. The buff gives you 6% bonus resistances. On a regular champion, you'd maybe have around 54 armor and 34 MR at level 10 or so. Getting the buff would give you 3 armor and 2 MR total. Not meaningless, but it's not going to dramatically change the outcome of any fight you take. Again, it scales better on tanks and as the game goes on, but just like Infernal, it can be unnoticeable throughout much of the game. Alright, so why are we downplaying the strength of dragons so much? Well, the big issue is that players often overforce a play to try and get dragon, when in reality the buffs are not that important to begin with. The most important thing that comes from taking dragons is honestly just the big soul buff that you get after killing 4. The individual buffs themselves are lackluster, which means that there are a lot of strategies that involve handing over one or multiple of the individual drakes in order to get the upper hand over your opponent in other more impactful ways. But even then, some analysts have started to take that thought a step further, where ideas like giving up the Dragon Soul entirely or not even wanting it yourself are actual strategic decisions you could make. There was actually a very interesting game during the 2020 Grand Finals between Damwon and Suning last year. Suning already had 3 dragons and the final Cloud Dragon for their soul point was spawning. Suning should clearly fight over this 4th dragon, right? Well, some analysts believe that they shouldn't, for multiple reasons. 1, Damwon had a gold lead and a much better teamfighting comp with an Ornn instead of a Fiora who'd prefer to be split pushing. Unsurprisingly, Damwon went on to win this fight with those advantages. But the part that we'd like to focus on is how Suning may have actually been worse off in the game if they had actually won the fight and gotten the Dragon Soul. As we stated, Damwon has the better teamfighting comp. If Suning took the soul, that just means Elder Dragon will spawn from now on, which is the most powerful buff in the game. That would force Suning to teamfight every time it spawns. Whereas, if they don't take the Dragon Soul, they can just keep handing over Cloud Dragons, which aren't worth all that much, as we recently discussed. Okay, so what are we getting at? This is cool to know, but it's not like you could ever say this in solo queue without being flamed by your entire team. Well, the goal wasn't to have you making crazy theoretical choices that even World Championship contenders haven't started making. It's more about understanding that getting Dragon shouldn't be a black and white approach of getting it being good and losing it being bad. One of the biggest recurring mistakes that we notice when reviewing low elo games is how crazy players can become when it comes to dragons in general. We constantly see really desperate plays over a single unimportant drake. Knowing which dragons are actually important to fight over can help you analyze the risk versus reward for contesting each one against your opponents. There's generally 3 major things you need to look out for when deciding whether you should contest a dragon or not. 1. Numbers advantage and enemy proximity. 2. Vision control over the area. And 3. The current power of both teams. This can come from either gold leads or specific champion spikes. Starting with the first, we constantly see low elo junglers starting the dragon just because they feel like it, without full knowledge of where everyone is on the map. In this clip, the Rift's newest edgelord starts the ocean dragon with zero vision of almost anyone on the enemy team. This was a huge mistake, as a bunch of his opponents happened to be in close proximity, and he was vastly outnumbered since his own team wasn't even there, all resulting in a huge shutdown for Zed, even if Viego did manage to secure the buff. As we said, considering the risks versus reward of each dragon is your path to success. The risk of giving a massive shutdown here was definitely not worth a single ocean dragon. Viego did manage to secure one more dragon, putting his team at soul point this game. Unfortunately, the previous shutdown slowed down his own snowball and allowed the blue team to stabilize. With the hard scaling of Kayle, Vayne, and Lulu, it no longer mattered that the red team had a dragon advantage, since they could no longer acquire any more dragons to get the soul buff. Therefore, all the previous ones they acquired were utterly useless. Anytime you can follow Rule 1 for acquiring dragons, it should make the capture incredibly simple. As an example, this game Nidalee spots the enemy Lee Sin trying to gank top lane, so she immediately paths over to dragon and takes it completely for free. These are the kinds of dragon kills that you want early on. As we said, the buff from Infernal and Mountain Dragons are nearly meaningless this early into the game, which means the risk that you exert for them during the early game should be close to zero, otherwise they're probably not worth it. As for rule number 2 regarding vision control, we have a very good example as to how things should be done. Rakan is playing very well by setting up the dragon over a minute before it is even going to spawn. He's already in the river, placing wards, and secures the Scuttle Crab himself to make sure the enemy team can't take it. He also does something that we'd recommend every support player does, which is to place all his wards down and immediately recall for even more. That's a fantastic way to get more vision control simply by having access to more regular and control wards than your opponents by the time the objective spawns. Rakan then comes back and together with his team establish complete vision control over the area before the dragon spawns. Now here's the learning part of this clip. If we swap over to the blue team's perspective, looking at the minimap, we can see that they have very limited vision of the area around dragon. So what do? Well, they just leave it. This is a great example of solid gameplay from both sides. The red team, led by Rakan, established superb vision control over the dragon. The blue team, realizing that they messed up their vision control, decided that the dragon was not worth the risk of fighting on enemy vision. Yeah, it sucks to give over the third dragon, but it's definitely better to fight for the fourth on even terms than it is to fight for the third at a huge vision disadvantage. Lastly, there's the third rule, which is to fight over the dragon only when you know that you can actually beat your opponents. We've already hinted at this during one of our earlier clips where we discussed scaling. Even if you're even in gold with your opponents, you may not want to fight a team comp filled with early game champs. The single dragon is not worth the risk of losing that fight early on. There's also item completion spikes to think about. You may have similar CS and kills compared to your opponents, but they may have just completed their core items first while you're sitting on components. It'd be worth it to just hand over that dragon, as fighting down on completed items is again not worth the risk of losing the fight. Rule 3 tends to be the most frustrating rule of them all to follow in solo queue, as it's the one players break the most often. For example, in this clip, we can see the blue team down a significant amount of gold. Giving the enemy dragon here is definitely the right idea, as it's only the second. There's plenty of time to catch up before the enemy team threatens to take the soul. Kled recognizes this and actually makes the correct call to not move from top. Unfortunately, his team still decides to fight over and die at the objective. The best part of it all, we can actually see him getting harassed with question mark pings despite making the correct call. When it comes to situations like this, the only advice we can offer is to learn from it and ignore the criticism from your random teammates. You can't control their actions, but you can most definitely learn from your own and become a better player. Knowing when to concede an objective and knowing when to actually fight over it will make you a much better player in the long run and is well worth any flame you might receive for it. At the end of the day, making decisions around dragon shouldn't be that difficult. The only hard part is understanding the risk versus rewards of obtaining it. Where most players seem to struggle is simply how much they value this objective. Hopefully this guide helped ground your expectations for what dragons actually provide and helps you to make better choices around taking it. By the way, you should know where these videos come from. Skillcapped. It's the best place to be if you actually want to improve at League of Legends. We have the best and the most LoL guides on the internet that really do work. The best part is that you don't have to take our word for it. If you don't climb 5 divisions while using skillcapped, you can claim a refund. So give it a shot and get the rank you've always wanted for Season 11. Check us out after this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.